Stanford University.
Welcome to the seminar on People, Computers, and Design. I'm Terry Winograd. Second week, so you should probably know the drill by now, but just to repeat, if you're taking the course for credit, try to catch the 1 unit of credit you get for just coming. Try to catch the sign-up sheet as it goes around and sign it. Otherwise, you'll be up here at the front afterwards. You can come put your name on it. And if you sign all of those, then you've got credit. Otherwise, we'll ask you for some documentation at the end. Reminder, if you're signed up for credit, you need to attend all but at most 2 of the sessions in class, and then you can watch the other 2 on TV. If you're not doing it for credit, feel free to watch it, whichever ones are convenient on the tube, or if you're a SCPD. Next week, we have Vic Singh, interesting young guy, and he's young even by most of your standards, not just mine. I think he's 25. He was named as one of the top Technology Review has a list of young innovators, and he was listed. He worked at Yahoo a couple of years ago, so he was even younger, and developed what's called BOSS, B-O-S-S, which is Build Your Own Search System, which was opening up some of their internal mechanisms so that third parties could develop new applications that made use of their data. And he will be talking Web 3.0, right? I don't know, he doesn't call it that, but it's sort of where are things going with all of these new kinds of connections and third-party applications in social networking and so on. So it should be really interesting. This week we have Stephen Dow. Stephen has been with us as a postdoc since graduating from Georgia Tech, where he did interesting work on how people respond to presence in sort of different kind of role-playing situations. Here he switched his attention to design theory and how do we evaluate different design processes, and in particular, his focus has been on prototyping, which is what he will talk about.
Thank you, Terry. How's everybody doing today?
Great.
Great. Designers discover and manipulate variables that are difficult to articulate and often very context dependent. Designers sketch and prototype not just to get out what they already have in their head, but to instigate a process of discovery. Today's talk is going to present a series of experiments that look at how prototyping practices impact design outcome. And I'm going to start off with a little help from Dilbert. So the boss says, we've hired the world's most innovative design firm. We'll observe their successful methods and steal them for our own. Ha ha ha. And Dilbert says, maybe their secret is hiring smart people. And the boss says, I'm hoping it involves easels. So Dilbert, in this cartoon, raises an interesting point. Is it the methods that matter, or is it simply having smart, creative people that lead to good results? Our research takes as its hypothesis that the method does matter, that practices do have an impact on the outcome. I was over at the Stanford D School the other week. Are you guys familiar with the D School? So they have this meeting room. There's this interesting sign up in there. It says, believe in process. I find that very interesting. It's this very faith-based notion of what matters to get this result, to get to the outcome of the design process. And what we want to do in this research is move beyond that faith-oriented notion of design to more of an evidence-based discipline by conducting experimental work. And so first I'm going to present an anecdote. There is some evidence that prototyping practices affect outcome. There's the ceramics story. Ceramics teacher comes into class first day, splits his class up into 2 different groups. He tells one group, you're going to be graded entirely on quantity. Produce as many ceramics as you can within the quarter. He tells the other group, you're going to be graded on quality. Create one really good ceramic and you're going to be graded on that one. Well, at the end of the quarter, it turns out that the works of all the highest quality came from the quality group. The quantity group, thank you. So it was interesting, and Bales and Orland, who reported this story, wrote that while the quantity group was busily churning out work and learning from their mistakes, the quality group sat theorizing about perfection, and in the end had little more to show for their efforts than grandiose theories in a pile of dead clay. Great, so we have preliminary evidence, albeit anecdotal, that focusing on iteration rather than refinement actually produces better results. It affects the design outcome. And we speculate that repetition and deliberate practice helps designers learn more and discover new opportunities. And I think all of us would agree that iteration is valuable given enough time. But Michael Schrag, who has studied industrial culture across numerous industrial settings, argues that production schedules often discourage iteration in favor of realization, that people take fewer risks under pressure. And this aversion to iteration is defended as, well, we don't have time. We don't have time to iterate. So we approach this question empirically. Is it valuable to continue eliciting feedback when the common intuition is to stop iterating and start refining the concept? And so we conducted a between-subject study with 28 participants and manipulated their ability to iteratively prototype and get feedback within a creative design task. Our hypothesis is that iterating multiple times under those intense time constraints will produce better results than allocating that time to a single, to refinement, to a single product or prototype. More unforeseen issues will be discovered, new opportunities will emerge. So the trick here, and as many creativity researchers have pointed out, it's very difficult to measure what's going on creatively in one's head. The trick here was picking a design task that was somewhat representative of real-world design, yet at the same time allowed us to compare outcomes, compare the different things that people come up with. So the criteria for our task selection included, it needed to have an objectively measurable design outcome. We needed to be able to demonstrate creativity. So that meant there should be a variety of different solutions possible, not just one solution, and many different paths to get to that solution. So open-ended design tasks. Finally, we wanted a task where iteration would be possible, because we're interested in this experiment to look at iteration. So that meant people had to be able to create something and then get feedback on it. And that's kind of how we define iteration in this study. And participants should be able to complete this within a single lab session. So our solution to this was to pick an exercise fairly common in K through 12 schools, the egg drop design task. So who here has either done or heard of the egg drop design task? Almost everyone. Wow. All right. Well, I figured, this will probably be my only chance to do a live egg drop demo in a talk. So I brought two representative prototypes that people in my experiments built and a raw egg. And so I need two volunteers to help me out with this. Let's see hands. OK, 1 and 2, right there. Come on down. All right, so first question is, which one do you guys think is going to win?
I picked that one.
Want to guess? It's a shoe design. This one's more of a parachute design. All right, well, I say we drop the parachute first, because it may not break. The other one, it may break. So why don't you go ahead. We've got a paper down here. So I'd suggest actually getting up on the table. If you be careful there. Yeah. And so how we did this in the actual experiment, before you drop that, is we had people drop from 1 foot, and then 2 feet, and then 3 feet, up until the egg cracked. And that's a measure of performance. How high does the egg get without cracking? And on average, we're at about 6, 7 feet. We're going to go quite a bit higher than that here. OK, ready? Go. And it looks like the egg survived. Yay. Next. Here, I'll help you up. There you go. All right, so I'm going to put the egg in there. And on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Oh! Splatter. Thank you. Thanks for your help, guys. All right, that was fun. So, as I mentioned, we had a performance metric, the height of the egg when it cracks. And we gave all the participants a set of materials, the same set of materials, and they designed their egg in this little, or their vessel in this area right next to the drop zone. So they were working with the materials. It was a hands-on activity. People came up with widely different ideas, and then they could test drop their egg vessels right next to the design area. Our experiment had 2 conditions, 14 participants in each, and we balanced across these conditions for whether or not they had done the egg drop task before, how much design experience they had prior to this, and gender. They all worked on the task individually as well. It wasn't a group experience. Participants in the non-iteration group were given 1 egg and told that it would be used in the final egg drop. In the iteration group, they were given a carton of eggs, and then they were encouraged to test drop their eggs periodically. So we said, now please test your design. Most of the participants did drop their vessel at that time, but about 10% of the people chose to not to at that point. We didn't physically force anyone to test their egg vessels. So what was important here is that participants across both conditions disposed of all their prototypes after the design phase. So at this point in the experiment, everything was thrown away, and they came into this final build stage with only what they had learned prior. And after that, we had a short interview where we asked them to describe their design and talk about what they thought would happen when their egg vessel dropped. And then we had the final egg drop. So what did our results show? Well, comparing conditions, the results showed that under time constraints, the several rapid iterations, those several rapid prototypes yielded better results than allocating that time to just refining a concept. So what did participants actually do in these 2 conditions? Well, most of the time, participants built. In the non-iteration condition, they were building the entire time. Maybe they were testing stuff on top of the table. They continued to refine their idea throughout this test period. In the iteration condition, participants tended to really test out their concept, often dropping multiple times, getting up on the table, to the point where the egg would actually crack. So we had a lot of cracked eggs. Overall, both conditions produced a wide variety of vessels. Some employed parachutes and landing pads. Others attempted to suspend the egg in some sort of box or triangle. Others tried to create a canopy to catch the egg raw. So what we learned actually from running these experiments, and for all you parents out there with kids in high school that are about to do this, this is what you need to know. Successful vessels seem to account for slowing the egg's fall, distancing the egg from the first point of impact, handling the balance after impact, so it often hits and then falls to the side and cracks, and then simply containing the egg. These are sort of 4 key factors that we noticed, and what participants had to discover through their process of prototyping and getting feedback. Notably, several of the top performers all came from the iteration condition and were vastly different concepts. There was no silver bullet feature. They all had really different ideas that seemed to work for them. So where did people come up with these ideas? Folks who had done the egg drop experience before remembered some of the design ideas.
Last time I did this was like 10 years ago or something. and I have some vague recollection of like some box sort of thing that kind of like kept the egg suspended in the middle of it.
Notice he did not actually implement that idea of suspending the egg, but it was available to him as an option. He had this memory of when he had done it in class, and maybe someone else had done it. But what was interesting is we could actually look at the data if you had done the egg drop experience before or had not done it. And unsurprisingly, it turns out that prior exposure to the task helps. You come into this experiment, if you've done it before, you're going to do better on it in my experiment. These folks are probably exposed to more examples, and so they had intuitions about what to do. More interesting is the interaction between prior experience and our manipulation of whether or not they could get iterative feedback. Iteration really aided the participants who had done the egg drop experience prior to coming into the experiment. And so you might expect that prior experience provides a similar advantage in both conditions, or maybe even a stronger advantage for people who had not done it before, because it's, it provides them feedback. Those novices would have feedback, but actually it turned out this way. So it seems that my hypothesis is that having prior exposure to a design task does two things. One, it provides a bunch of design examples or exemplars to access an initial set of ideas, but it also gives people this experience of listening to feedback and observing what happened and being able to integrate that into subsequent design ideas. It's in a sense that interpreting feedback is a separate operation from simply knowing the design exemplars. So the interviews provided additional insight into how participants approached feedback differently and why feedback mattered.
Experimentation with materials is important at the very beginning, so you figure out like everything possible that you can do with them, and then it's also really important to see like what actually happens when it hits, because my first design I didn't realize it would hit so hard or hit at such different angles.
So people got their feedback after doing the drops, and some people focused on whether or not the egg, the binary interpretation, did the egg break or did it not break? Other people formed more nuanced understandings of why the egg broke, what can I do to fix it? And so here people are responding to the feedback that they got.
Try to tape these things and to support the egg, and then I decided to put it on the whole platform.
I think the main problem with the last design is that it also wasn't covering the egg enough, so I was afraid it was going to fall out.
But I realized I need more on the sides as well to help reduce the pressure, and I added a second cone inside, which I didn't have before.
Interestingly, people tended to, and it's sort of expected, people listen to the feedback they're getting and they respond to that in their designs. They make changes corresponding to those, to what they observed. But what was interesting is it kind of led to slight variations of an existing concept, not necessarily a divergent exploration of different possibilities. And so here's one example of 4 iterations of an existing design concept getting feedback in between each one. So how much did participants actually explore different ideas? Did they consider a broad range of possibilities?
No, I don't know. For some reason, this seems to be the only idea. And there needs to be a platform, and then as good a cushion as possible with the materials. I don't see any other way.
I'm not a very good outside-the-box thinker, so I kind of just had one idea, and I was going to try and make it work.
I kind of went with the whole parachute idea and what I had from the beginning. So
this is the best approach for such a design.
So the last guy here was in the non-iteration condition, but all the other folks were in the iteration condition. Participants tended to pick a concept very early in the process and stick with it. And this is partly attributed to the short time frame. So they are in an experimental setting. They only had a certain amount of time to design. But it was this element of fixation. They actually believed that they had explored all the possibilities and that this was the only way it could be done. That was what was really interesting. And this notion of functional fixation actually has been around since 1945, first introduced by Carl Duncker in a series of experiments with the candle problem. And what he did is he had people come in and he gave them the following materials. And the task was to affix the candle to the wall and light the candle without having any of the candle wax drip down onto the table. So does anyone want to guess the answer? Yes. You probably knew that, I'm guessing. He said, use the box. That's right. So the answer is, this is quite a challenge for people. The insight here is that the box of tacks can actually be used as a holder for the candle. What's really interesting, though, is if you do this experiment again and give people the same materials, but instead the box is empty at the beginning of the experiment, so you've dumped the tacks out onto the table, and the box is just sitting there, people are much more likely to solve this problem. And so people are exhibiting functional fixation and viewing the box's primary function as a container for tacks. And so maybe participants just haven't fully explored the space of possibilities for egg drop designs. And it really motivated our next research question, which is, can we improve exploration and reduce instances of functional fixation by structuring the process differently? So if we structure the process in parallel, does creating prototypes in parallel and explicitly enabling comparison provide a performance advantage over a more serial approach to design? And then for this experiment, we wanted to get out of egg drop and raw eggs into issues more relevant to digital media and computing. And so, but just as with the egg drop, we wanted this criteria of being able to have creatively diverse ideas as well as objectively measurable results. And what we came up with was having participants design web banner ads. And in this case, performance is measured by placing all the ad ideas up at one time as part of a live ad campaign. And we were able to collect analytics through the site that we hosted it on, which was myspace.com, as well as Google Analytics. So this is key. I mentioned how it's difficult to measure what's going on in one's head, measure creativity. What we're doing here is we're getting an objective design performance measure to gain insights into how the process affects the outcome. So how does this work? We had participants create ads for the same client. In this case, we used Ambidextrous Design Magazine. It's a journal of design on Stanford campus run by students. Does anyone work for Ambidextrous? No? Okay. Subjects are given a short brief describing the client and what sort of advertising they're looking for. They all worked in this very simple graphic editing tool that's built into the myspace.com website. It's a Flash-based tool, really simple. It was nice because it didn't require participants to know or learn Photoshop. Everyone kind of came in on the same level. We recruited 33 participants and placed them into the two conditions and balanced for had they done ad or graphic design before, gender again, and it was again an individual task. It was not a group-based design task. So what were these two conditions? Well, we had each participant create 5 prototypes in the same amount of time, and then a final design. In the serial condition, participants received critique after they created each prototype. So they received some sort of feedback along the way after each design they created. In the parallel condition, they received critique after creating 3 prototypes. Then they made 2 more prototypes and received feedback on those, and then they created their final ad design. So it's a serial process, serial iteration, versus a parallel process where they narrow down into one concept. And the only difference between the conditions was the timing of the critique. So what kind of feedback or critique did participants receive on each ad? Well, before the study, we had ad professionals come in and help us develop this system by which we could provide critique on each ad. Experimenters would choose statements from a catalog of critique statements, we had about 50 statements in 3 different categories: theme, layout, and then the surface level font, color, and graphics. So, for example, the experimenter may choose the following statements to apply to the ad here on the right. One from each of the following categories. The critique statements were meant to be technical in nature, to provide high-level direction without being explicitly positive or negative in the language. Importantly, the feedback was the same in both conditions, and we made efforts to avoid introducing bias. The experimenter selected from pre-authored critique statements, and in the parallel condition, they viewed and critiqued those parallel ads sequentially. So they would finish their critique on one ad before moving to the next. They also didn't make explicit comparisons between the parallel ads, like saying the color in this ad is better than the color in that one. They're all critiqued individually within themselves. So no statements, and also no statements were repeated within a participant. So what we got in the end was a bunch of final ads. Very different concepts people came up with for this ambidextrous design magazine. And we launched a campaign, a 15-day ad campaign on myspace.com, where all these ads ran in parallel, targeted at a group of MySpace users who might be interested in this magazine. In total, we generated over 1 million impressions or ad viewings, and it's produced several performance metrics on the ads. Click-through rate, so how many times did MySpace users click on the ad, divided by how many times it was shown. Time on site, so once they actually reached, if they clicked on the ad and they went to Ambidextrous Magazine website, how long did they spend on the website? We have the Google Analytics telling us how long they spent there. And then we had expert ratings. Both the clients of the magazine as well as ad professionals individually rated the ads on a scale of 0 to 50. Actually, there are several different dimensions there. And so, according to the MySpace ad data, MySpace users clicked parallel ads more often than serial ads. I've displayed them here as clicks per million. So what that meant is, based on the number of impressions that were shown, the parallel ads actually got more clicks, more attention than the serial ads. Also, interestingly, the parallel ads were the visitors who went into the website spent more time on the website. So not only did it get more people there, once they were there, they spent more time. So kind of an indicator of the type of audience it was reaching. It was reaching the people who were genuinely interested in this magazine. And this wasn't statistically significant, but it's notable and provides some evidence that the parallel ads did better at reaching the target audience. Finally, the independent expert raters, both the ad professionals and the magazine editors, judged the parallel ads to be better than the serial ads. And so by all these measures, the parallel process outperformed the serial process. It gets even more interesting when we try to analyze why we saw this difference between parallel and serial. Why is this approach better? Our first hypothesis, we believe one factor is that comparison helped participants learn throughout the process. And the theoretical foundation for this belief is Deidre Gentner's work on comparison and analogy. She and her collaborators ran a series of experiments using negotiation problems. So participants would offer a negotiated lease, would try to offer a solution to one of these negotiation situations. So for example, a landlord and a renter. Landlord wants to get $900 for rent. Renter wants to pay $600. Well, the simple sort of naive solution to this would be to simply split the difference, 750, right? Well, another strategy, what they actually want the folks to learn, a good negotiation strategy is to look at some of the more subtle factors involved. Say the landlord is worried about how much gas is going to cost in the winter. A trade-off solution would be to agree on a lower rent, but then to split the gas utility bill. A more subtle, nuanced negotiation than just simply splitting the difference. Another strategy is the contingent contract, where the solution depends on some future event. So the agreement might be, go ahead and pay $700, but then you can pay another $100 if the gas bill goes over a certain level. If the gas bill goes over $200, then you're going to pay $100 more than the rent that we've agreed upon. So again, it's this more nuanced negotiation. So these are the three possible types of strategies that could be offered in these landlord-renter lease problems. And what they did is they would give people case studies. Case studies were pioneered by the Harvard Business School to share actual stories from the real world, from the professional world, with students who are learning how to be business savvy. And so Gettner and her colleagues ran a series of experiments giving people case studies, and this one in particular looks at the value of comparison. What they did was they compared having separate case studies to having comparison case studies. In the separate cases condition, they would get the same cases as the other condition, but they would be asked to describe the solution in this case after each one. So they would read one, describe the solution for it, and then read another and describe the solution for it. In the comparison case, they simply had people describe the parallels of the two solutions. So it explicitly forced them to compare the difference between these two cases. The results found that in the comparison case condition, participants were nearly 3 times more likely to offer the preferred solutions, not the simple split the difference solutions. Gettner argues that without this explicit comparison, participants are more likely to focus on surface similarities or surface features of these cases. That comparing cases leads to a more general problem-solving schema that can capture the underlying structure, the important parts of applying these strategies to new situations. So, bouncing back to the ad study, perhaps viewing and processing these critique statements in parallel, side by side, helped participants extract important graphic design principles. Another hypothesis is that it derives from looking at the participants' set of design ideas. They had created 6 of these designs. And they would say stuff, in the serial condition, they would say stuff like, I tried to find a good idea, and then use that idea and keep improving it to get feedback, so I pretty much stuck with the same idea. We're hearing a lot of the same things we had heard in the egg drop study about, thinking, well, I'll just stick with the same idea and keep improving it. And then looking at the ideas from a bird's eye view, the serial participants' ads seem to be more similar as a whole. And to back up this intuition, we decided to obtain a measure of similarity. And how we did that was we took the participants' 6 ad designs and we did pairwise comparisons online on Mechanical Turk, Amazon Mechanical Turk. And so for each ad, they could judge on a scale from 0 to 7, how similar are these 2 ads? And what that does is when you add up all the similarities between all the pairs of an individual's ads and then put that in front of 30 Mechanical Turk viewers, judgers, you get a large sample of similarity measures for each participant. And what we found is that sets of parallel ads were rated much less similar than the serial ads. So the parallel ads were more divergent. Which leads us to our second hypothesis here, that parallel ads generated a wider variety of design concepts, of ad concepts, and perhaps doing so helped them explore more fully the range of possibilities for this task. Our third point of analysis comes from listening to serial participants react negatively to the critique. So one participant, for example, said, I got really negative comments saying that the clients are looking for a creative and clever ad, which in other words is saying my ad is stupid or ridiculous. 8 of 17 serial participants described something negative about the critique they were receiving. none of the parallel participants described negative comments about the critique. So another thing we had done, we were sort of thinking about this prior to running the experiment, we deployed a self-efficacy exam before and after the ad design task. So the self-efficacy exam asked participants to report their own ability to create ads, to understand design problems, to detect problems in their design, and to incorporate feedback. It's a self-report measure. And we captured this before and after the task. Now, the change in self-efficacy score is why it's interesting. It's an indication of how the conditions, the manipulation that we conducted, the process that we imposed on folks, influenced their own belief in their design abilities. And what we found was the following. Parallel participants significantly gained self-efficacy compared to serial participants who reported no change in their perceived ability. So triangulating this finding with the serial participants' negative views of the critique, we put forth a third contributing factor, that serial participants perceive the critique as negative and thus gain no confidence on the task. Self-efficacy theory has demonstrated that task-specific self-efficacy is predictive of performance. So the more you believe in your ability to do the task, the better you're going to perform. And so this is why that's interesting. That's part of the research here. So to summarize what we've talked about so far, iteration helps designers discover what variables and constraints are in play and how best to manipulate them. Iteration, so for example, in the egg drop study, helped the participants realize that after you drop the design, it's going to fall to the side, and so you need to account for that, and so on. As we saw in the egg drop study, though, iteration did not automatically lead to more divergent exploration. If anything, the feedback had directly influenced the next step. So they got feedback, and they were thinking, well, what can I do to my design to make it better? So it was a constant improving on the existing idea rather than exploring other possibilities. And finally, the ad design study showed that spreading conceptual design across multiple prototypes in parallel not only led to better overall results, it helped participants create more diverse ideas. They had come up with actually less similar concepts in the process and avoided investing too much in a single concept. They were less emotionally involved in any particular idea. And from here, I want to talk about where we're going to go with this research. First, I was really inspired by what I saw in the interviews, talking to participants who came in. Did anyone do any of my studies? No? Oh, great. Got one. One of the participants was talking about this interesting relationship I see between the critique and what you're supposed to learn from it and your emotional reaction to it. So let's hear what he says about it.
These guys, are telling me that I am completely, doing something wrong here. So it took me a while to get past the I'm a failure at this and to, well, okay, how can I go about fixing it in the ways they suggested? So there was a short period where there was the emotional response overwhelmed any positive, logical impact that this ended up having.
It's interesting. Researchers have known for quite a while that an individual's arousal can generally affect performance. The Yerkes-Dotson theory says that performance can actually decrease when you get over-aroused, that the optimal point is somewhere here in the middle. And of course, that peak probably shifts depending on what you're doing, whether you're doing dishes, you need to be pretty aroused to do dishes versus something that's your career, writing a dissertation or something like that. You need to have the focus. So what I think is particularly interesting is when you think about this in the context of design, where critique is the primary feedback channel for learning and improving your design. And yet at the same time, it's so emotionally impactful and potentially distracting or deflating or inspiring. So there's this interesting relationship here. Another area of interest for me explores a design technique used and many of the design thinking institutions, role-playing and what the benefits of this technique may have towards design. It also links up with stuff I had done at Georgia Tech, so I'm going to briefly talk about my dissertation work here. We built this immersive role-playing experience called AR Facade. This is a whole separate talk, but it was interesting because it immersed people physically in this environment with two virtual characters who were interactive, and you could talk to them using natural speech, physical gesture. Everything in the environment was physically real. It was a 600 square foot physical apartment, except for these two virtual characters, Trip and Grace, who were graphically imposed using AR, augmented reality. So they kind of visually appeared as if they were standing in front of you. And it turns out when the player enters this space and starts interacting with the characters, they realize that they're kind of pulled into this marital disagreement. And they're in the middle of this argument. And the characters are looking to the player to help them work out the marital difficulties they're having. It's pretty interesting. I've got a lot of videos of people interacting with these characters and really trying to help them out, really looking for any way to engage that situation and help them solve their problems. And why I bring it up is that it's interesting because people really take on that role. And I'm curious what people actually learn from getting to that point where they're physically, emotionally kind of thinking in the mind of someone that they're not. And the potential benefits of role-playing techniques, both in technology-mediated situations as well as in face-to-face situations. So, is role-playing a good idea? It has potentially many benefits, from physically arousing people, getting them up and getting their blood moving, to team building in corporate settings and in team situations where you want people to break down those barriers. But is there actually something about simulating what another person feels and having that open up realizations about the people that they're designing for that could not have been discovered without doing that technique? I think that's a really interesting area for future work.
Can you explain what it means to take on that role? So that your participant, your subject, with the VR glasses on,
Yeah.
they took on Grace or Trip, or they took on the role of the counselor answering the questions?
They took on the role of the counselor. Actually, they were the friend invited over for drinks. And so Trip and Grace, there's actually a desktop version of this game, which is seen over here on the right. We learned a lot from doing the contrast of the desktop version with the AR version. But you can go and download the desktop version at interactivestory.net and interact with the characters that way. The same personalities, the same graphical representation of the characters in the desktop game, except you're interacting with them through the keyboard and mouse. But it's sort of the first really successful interactive story that combined interaction and narrative. So it had some overarching purpose to the experience, but at the same time gave people the experience of having agency, having some impact on what was going to happen as the scenario played on. And what my dissertation looked at is what affected the physical interface, changing it to this very immersive experience where people felt like they were in the middle of it all, how that changed the experience. And I think that there's a couple interesting things to say there, but I'm going to pass on those for now. So finally, I want to work on improving the experimental process. So running these sorts of experiments I've been talking about today have been very time-consuming, involves many different types of people have to come in and as both participants as well as critique providers as well as external judges. And it's very limited by the amount of hours that have to be hands-on in these experiments. So what I want to do is leverage online tools like Amazon Mechanical Turk to obtain large scales of manual labor, essentially so that we could recruit large numbers of people to submit designs as participants, to offer critiques on others' designs, to judge whether or not they think ideas are similar or how well they fit a certain criteria, sort of a performance measure. All of these things would be helpful for running these experiments, potentially helpful as a design environment to help designers when they're trying to design things, so potential end user benefits as well. And so before I end, I just want to say, if you want to help out with this research, if you want to get involved, I'd love to speak to you about potentially helping me out with this. And that's it. I'll take questions. Thank you. Adrian, hi.
How long ad design take? I'm imagining it took longer than the sequence.
No. So you asked how long did the parallel case take? Actually, we timed it out so that we had exactly the same amount of time for the parallel condition as we did for the serial condition. So they got the same amount of time to design each ad. They designed the same number of ads, and they had the same amount of time to read over the critique before they started on their next ad. So just to make it a little more clear, like in the parallel case, they had created 3 ads, so they got, rather than 5 minutes to interpret the feedback, they got 15 minutes to interpret the feedback. That's not the exact time of it, but it was more on the minutes level. But
I was trying to help you jump to a conclusion that if you don't have the data, I think if you fix those parameters, that if the increase in click-throughs is marginal, which it was noticeable, but it wasn't, if this was a commercial situation, it may be that the first fit approach, sequential, which might be a faster process, the first thing that comes to mind, might be good enough. So then you get into this trade-off between, in computer science, there's one between best fit and first fit.
yeah,
Sequential may be a first fit, and the parallel may be a process of refining.
so I think I got what you're saying. And one of the things that I'm doing right now is, what we did not do is compare ads that came earlier in the process. So what had they created in the second ad or their third ad? Is that at the same level of performance as the final ads that they created? So in the serial condition, after you received a couple rounds of feedback, could you have stopped there and reached a sufficient level of performance rather than going all the way to the end? I think that's what you're getting at with your line of question. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm wondering if it explains why we see so many average, mediocre ads and occasional real winners. and it may just be that the difference in the return on investment is not large enough to justify everybody getting really good at ad design.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but yes.
In the parallel, the critique in the parallel, were they told which critique goes for which ad, and was there any, at least they could interpret it that there is some, in some of the critique people are comparing the ad, and in that way giving them additional information that was not given in the serial.
They did not compare. In the parallel case, the critique providers did not compare the ads.
And so they assign each critique point to a specific ad.
That's right. Well, no. They chose critique statements based on what was in the ad.
On 3 ads or just 1 ad?
They chose 3 statements for each ad.
If I tell you something, one of the critique on the font, like the font is just right, or whatever the thing, do I address it specifically to one of the ads, or just in general, and it's your problem to interpret which ad I'm talking about?
It's addressed to a specific ad. So rather than providing these critique statements over a set of ads or, generally how good are you doing, it's all applied to a specific design. And now, this was done, this is an experiment, so it had to be very controlled. This isn't necessarily what happens out,
Right, but when I address a specific issue on one ad, and I'm not addressing that issue on other end, the person who created it may interpret that the other end don't have this problem or don't have those successes.
Yep.
So there is, in the interpretation, some implicit critique that was not said, and that can give additional...
I think that's one of the things I have yet to do is go through the interviews and fully explore the explanations that people gave, their reactions to the feedback, their interpretation of what they should do, or what they're doing right or wrong. And I think that's going to be an interesting area. And I think that ties into the stuff I was talking about with emotions. And the fact that you're trying to learn from this, and at the same time it's sort of, you're getting confused and conflicted, potentially conflicted messages from a critique provider or multiple providers, and how that actually, how people take that in and turn that into the subsequent designs, I think deserves a lot more research. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I see it as when you work, for example, when you work with students and you don't want to give them the answer, but you want to lead them to discover the answer, how do you phrase it in a certain way? So, and the fact maybe that you know the answer, but you don't want to say it, or you yourself don't know the answer. You want them to discover it.
I think it's a really excellent question.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. Definitely. Hi.
I have a few questions. On the study, if you look at each critique as like a piece of information, right? Like whenever you do you're giving them information about what good design is. So is the total amount of comments given to each person among studies the total number of critiques, basically?
The total number of critiques were the same. We tried our best to match the two conditions. Now, it might be that certain critique statements had more words, or if you did some sort of information bit analysis of the critique statements. We haven't gone to that low level, but it was a set list of 50 or so critique statements, and the same number of critique statements were applied in both conditions. Actually, a total of 5 times 3, 15 critique statements.
And then I have another question about the AR app. So it seems like marriage counseling is like a very nuanced, like, human interaction. So how are you able to simulate that kind of interaction with virtual characters? Like, behind the scenes controlling characters, or how are you able? I feel like
that's a great
computers wouldn't be ready to like interact with the human on something.
Yeah, this is a really interesting story, very close to my heart, because yes, there were human operators involved. But actually, it was an interesting relationship between what the machine algorithms did and what the human operators did to pull off this experience. And first of all, I should mention that the original facade game, the desktop facade game, was created by Michael Matthias and Andrew Stern, and has been around for about 6 years now. Something they had worked on for their dissertation, and has received a lot of critical acclaim. And so we were leveraging all this work that they had done in AI in creating these characters, and they came up with some really innovating concepts in terms of how you break down conversational beats, how you structure those over time, and how they process natural language. And so they had written a bunch of software to do this and to actually pull off the desktop game. All of that works without the use of human operators. And so we came in and built the AR version. And the main thing what we did first is we had human operators doing the speech recognition. We didn't want to mess around with bad interpretation of what the person actually said. So we just had someone sitting in the back typing in what they heard the player say, and also pressing buttons for gestures that they had done. So you can hug the characters, you can comfort them. And then what we started to do, it got really interesting because we started to think, well, could we improve the experience by sort of pulling out some of the machine algorithms and giving more control over to the human operator? And so we created this alternative version of the experience, really of the back end. The back end is the only thing that changed, where we tore out the natural language processor that Facade had and had the human operator directly select the high-level conceptual categories that Facade uses to facilitate the experience. And these are things like, they're from the player perspective, so the player wants to flirt. The player wants to comfort. The player wants to be argumentative. And so the human operator would make that interpretation. What is the player trying to do? And then select from one of these categories. And there are interesting interface issues that came up there. But even doing so, there was still a pretty intelligent system after that point of taking what this player is intending to do and deciding how the characters should react to it and animating the characters on the fly. So I just wrote a paper on this, so I'm pretty excited about it. But any other questions? Yes?
You balanced design experience in the ad test.
Right.
Did you find that there's a difference between, like, how the parallel process versus the serial process had an impact on more experienced designers versus less experienced?
So you asked if you had prior ad design experience, did that change how the structure of the process affected them? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really interesting question, and I don't have anything statistically interesting to say about it. And I haven't looked at that data for a while. If you want to come and help me unpack that a bit, I'd love to get into it more, but yeah?
I'm just wondering, what do you think would happen if you changed things slightly where the critiques were just generated randomly instead of genuine critique?
That's a great question. Actually, we just ran that study. So we ran a study where we had 3 conditions. Using the technique that we used prior, where we had the experimenter apply critique statements directed at the ads. Random, where we just randomly generated critique from the same list of critique statements. We just plopped some in there. And then no feedback at all. So just kind of creating the same number of prototypes with no feedback in the middle. And my initial results on this, I've only done the expert review part of it. I'm currently running the ad campaign to see how it performs. But the expert reviewers gave us kind of what I expected. Directed feedback did the best, followed by random feedback, did decently, followed by no feedback at all. And the random feedback, I think because of how we had designed this feedback system, it was sort of general principles about graphic design that people could read into the data, read into the critique that they were getting and learn something from it, regardless of how appropriate it was towards their design. So that was interesting too.
Some emotional response at random.
Yep. Yeah. And it was interesting how some people reacted very negatively towards the random feedback. Like, what does this have to do with my ad? And some people were like, this is really useful. Like, that helped me a lot. It helped me, so. Hi. Okay. Back one first.
Yeah, maybe a good comparing the 2 studies you presented. One aspect is the social. One important aspect to me is the social context within which they occur, whether within the experiment or a relationship between the experimenter and the subject. I guess in terms of in the initial one, were there some expectations in terms of optimal performance? The metric there, in a sense, was the objective world. Did they crack or not? But was there a backstory there, for instance, to provide motivation? And the other one, where it seems to be socially fraught, because the subject was instructed that, random or not, these are people that are evaluating your performance. And, so, as well as the ultimate criteria is a social mass phenomenon.
Let me describe it a bit more, and then if you have a question, you can follow up. But in the first study, we didn't tell people how well others performed on the egg drop, but everyone wanted to know. You know, how well did other people do? How, you know, what's my benchmark here, really? And I think that there's reason to believe that telling people or not telling people what others have done would significantly change how motivated they are to keep going, to persevere and keep designing to a certain level. In the second study, how we set it up was we told the participants that there was an expert in ad design who was going to review your ads. They never saw the expert. They never got to meet the expert face to face. When the interviewer came in to conduct the interview, they always referred to the expert in sort of third person. You know, what did you think about what the ad expert had to say about your ad designs? And so it was this sort of, but you're right, there was this sort of interesting social dynamic that was created between the participant and this unknown.
It's not a critique, it's an ego cut down mechanism. Okay. The point is to push it down aside and then we'll see what's left.
But interestingly, the participants were very willing to give authority to that critique provider, partly due to the fact that these were mostly novices who came in to do the ad design. So they were in unfamiliar territory, so any sort of input they could get was useful for their process. I saw a question right here. Yeah.
I was wondering why that in the serial participants they perceive performance as negative rather than parallel participants because they put more value into the design.
What do you think?
I don't know, maybe because they only have one design per feedback, they feel that this is my valuable thing. Well, if you have several, then you say like, well, this one is bad, but maybe the others aren't so.
It's a good idea. I think that there's something to that. How many people have had that experience where you're designing something and you get stuck on an idea and you get an advisor or a teacher to tell you, you got to change it. I don't like it. It's really hard to, once you're stuck on that one idea, to kind of shift off. You've sunk a lot of investment, a lot of reasoning into this one particular concept, and to kind of switch over to another hill and go off in a different direction is really hard to do. And that's why you see in a lot of design institutes like the D School, they train people to come up with bad ideas. Come up with a dark horse random idea out of nowhere, get the bad ideas out there so that you can kind of, to me, I think of it as sort of you have a level of detachment, especially early on, to the particular ideas. You're highly invested in the process and in the outcome that you're going to get to, but it's these intermediate steps that you have to have some detachment from in order to be able to make those shifts. Yes. Yeah. You.
Two other dimensions I kind of I wanted to get an intuition on that. The first one is if you have longer tasks, instead of 5-minute design tasks, if you have tasks that take up to a week or even a month, do you think either is parallel iteration feasible, or would you perhaps think that users would inherently fall back into a implicit sequential stuff because there's so much investment going into each iteration? And the other dimension is if you have parallel tasks in which you have multiple collaborators working on the same design, how might that impact the interaction in the parallel versus sequential?
I think those are both great dimensions to continue exploring, both the longer time. So what happens if you're given a week? What sort of patterns do you fall into? What to me is interesting is where people shift over from a parallel process where they're thinking in multiple outcomes at one time to more of a serial process where they're thinking, okay, I'm going the right direction, now I just need to optimize on that. And I think there does need to be time for both. There does need to be time for parallel lines of thought, as well as that time to get it nailed down once you get to the last however long. And so where that transition occurs is an interesting thing. And then the social thing too, I think, is a good point. We've thought about it. I think both of these issues are things that are tricky to handle in experimental settings, and as we start to get going on it, we'll figure out ways to control for these things like social dynamics and so on that could conflict with the results that we're getting. So, back there.
Would you think that it would be best to use a parallel structure when you're doing more of the wireframing and the initial sketches, and then before you go to pixel perfect, narrow down, and then kind of move into a serial structure?
Depends on what you're designing, I guess.
Yeah.
Don't use wireframes for all types of designs, but I think that's generally the idea, right, is that you're doing rough things in parallel, and then like sketches are very rough. You can make many of them, and then as you get closer to the end, you're increasing the fidelity or the details of those designs. And I think it's interesting to think about how the nature of the prototype affects how people think about it, as well as how critique providers respond to the representation that you show them. There's been a bunch of research that shows that sketchy things are more likely to lead critique providers or potential users to say, to suggest much more different directions for the design idea. So what is believed is that the more abstract or the more holes that are in the representation, the more likely people are to be able to suggest different directions for the research, or to insert themselves. If they're a user, they're more likely to see themselves in this design or in this scenario than if you had created a video, for example, where you have Terry Winograd acting out some part. You're less likely to see yourself in that Terry Winograd role that he's playing than if you saw a cartoon figure playing that role. So the sketchier things are, that they believe it's more likely people are to provide more interesting and useful feedback in these early stages. So, all right. Thank you for your time.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.